genetic makeup altered to exhibit traits that are not naturally theirs. In other words, they're organisms that are created by the transfer or introduction of genetic material from one species to another in a way that could never happen in nature, or through traditional breeding methods. And so when you hear, if you get into these discussions, you hear, well, isn't this just traditional breeding? Haven't we been altering the plant's makeups for a long time? Yes, we have, for centuries, really, for thousands of years. But this is a very specific technology when you're actually moving genes from one species to another in a way that couldn't have happened. And all you have to do is go to the Monsanto or Dow or DuPont websites, where you'll see very, very clear distinctions between GE, genetically engineered, and conventionally bred crops. Now, the interesting thing is, while the science is quite clear, we have this absolutely hypocritical federal policy on this stuff. On the one hand, we have the U.S. Commerce Department, and specifically the Patent Office, who sees these organisms as obviously something very unique and new, because they've granted the seed company and chemical companies who own these patents hundreds and hundreds of patents, and they've been very successfully defended. So in other words, millions of dollars have been spent protecting these patents because these are unique, because these are unique life forms that are ownable. And yet over at the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, there's a general presumption that these foods are essentially the same as non-GE foods. In other words, the policy there is that as long as the crops are quote-unquote substantially equivalent to non-GE crops in terms of nutritional parameters like calories or carbohydrates or fiber or protein, then they're also presumed safe, and therefore they do not necessitate labels. And what's interesting, so you have, again, two hypocritical policies here. You have one that says they're completely unique, and the other that says they're completely the same. And what's ironic about the FDA's position is it's not something that was derived at by something like what we're having right here, which is a public discussion. In fact, the citizens weren't involved in that setting of that guidance whatsoever. In fact, it was adopted on a voluntary basis in 1992 under the leadership of Dan Quayle, who many of you remember. He didn't spell all that well, if you recall. But Dan, Vice President Quayle, led something called the Council on Competitiveness, where they actually looked at regulations that they could address that in theory could be blocking or getting in the way of commerce. Now, under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDA is actually required to prevent consumer deception by clarifying that a food label is misleading if it omits significant what's called material information. But in 1992, under this leadership of Vice President Quayle, they actually limited the definition of material to whether you can see it or taste it or smell it. It was really diabolical and brilliant, frankly. GE crops were not on the market until 1996, but by limiting it to whether it's organoleptic, whether you can see it or smell it or taste the difference, what that meant is that, because you really can't see, smell, or taste the difference in these crops, it meant that this was a way of preventing labeling and essentially creating an on-ramp for this technology. And after 21 years now, this policy is still in effect today. Now, we're calling for this to be updated. That's exactly the point of the petition. And again, as I said before, it would be wonderful if all of you would join and sign and encourage everybody else out there. Last week, you may have seen in the news that the USDA has now issued opened up a comment period on the latest genetically engineered crop, which is a corn that is resistant to 2,4-D. And I'm going to talk to you about this a little bit later. But this is an exact direct result of what happened starting in 1992, where because these crops, again, this is a crop that is resistant, so farmers can use as much 2,4-D, which is a very toxic herbicide that probably for folks with my hair color, you'll know, last time you heard the name 2,4-D, it's because it's 50% of Agent Orange. It's what we used in Vietnam, and there's a long, long legacy of Vietnamese and American participants who were exposed to these chemicals with severe and unassailable, I mean, there's no debate that this is a carcinogen, no debate that it has led to birth defects, and yet now we're sanctioning a crop that is resistant so farmers can use more of it. And that has come about because, again, the citizens are not engaged in this process. And that's why HB 660, that's why this New Hampshire bill is so important, because this is really much bigger than just GE. This is really about, is our country of, for, and by us, or is it of, for, and by a handful of chemical companies who own these patents? And I don't think there's anybody who can really argue with what I just said. It's a pretty open and shut matter. But before I go further down that road, let me establish a few more facts. And one of them, and I know this irritates a lot of my organic friends, but I want to be clear, neither I nor Just Label It are anti-GE. We're not opposed, I'm not personally opposed, nor is our organization saying we can be against genetic engineering. There's 1 million diabetics alive in this country today because of advances with genetically engineered insulin. And I believe that to say that you're opposed to genetic engineering is like saying you're anti-science. There's clearly a place for it. One hopes that these technologies will eventually produce some kinds of benefits, and I don't think that we can, as in a world that's moving towards 9.2 billion people by 2050, I don't think we can say that we're opposed to any kind of technology. Our belief, though, is that much more independent testing should be done, and people should know, while the testing is going on, while this stuff is being used, we should have the right to choose whether or not we want to support this system. So we do believe that there's a problem of an absence of independent testing, and particularly independent, and particularly longer-term testing. But we are not specifically opposed to the use of GE technology. We're pro-transparency, not anti-GE. So why we support the consumer right to know, I've probably already made it clear, but since 1996, when these first crops were introduced, they've been extremely successful in penetrating the marketplace. You may know that, if you've been reading up, that over 90% of the corn out there right now is genetically engineered. That over 85% of the soybeans out there have been genetically engineered. We have sugar beets, we have cotton, that are also equally dominant in their marketplace and in many other categories. And there's many, many, many more crops in the pipeline. Now, most of us, logically, would believe that these new patented life forms are safety tested the way new drugs would be at the FDA. They aren't, and they should be. As a matter of fact, it's, to be clear, to get these a new genetically engineered crop approved by the FDA, all you have to be able to do is, as a company, is show that you've done your own research. So the foxes are really guarding the hen houses here. Several National Academy of Science reports have affirmed that GE crops have the potential to introduce new toxins or allergens into our food and environment. But again, we really cannot say, and it would be irresponsible to say one way or the other whether they're safe or not, because we just haven't done the long-term testing. Yet, unlike the strict safety evaluations or approval of new drugs, there's no mandatory human clinical trials of GE crops, no tests of carcinogenicity or harm to fetuses, no long-term testing of neurological health risks, no requirement for long-term testing on animals, and there's a limited assessment of their potential to trigger new food allergies. So again, science has a lot of sorting out to do, and we believe that it will probably be decades before there's a firm, clear science one way or the other. Again, the absence of negativity is not the proof of safety. We really do owe it to ourselves in the 21st century to do that proof. But while science sorts this out, we really think that citizens should have the right to know, and obviously you all do too, otherwise you wouldn't be taking a piece of your Sunday here. So I want to be clear then that this is not about safety. And I noticed in the paper today, in the Sentinel's very nice editorial, that they referenced one of our state senators talking about the fact that she hasn't been able to, if she saw that it was absolutely about safety, then she would be she would be supportive of it, but she's not. I need to be clear, this is not about safety, because no one can say they're safe or unsafe. And by the way, if a product poses a safety hazard, we wouldn't be arguing for labeling. We'd be arguing to take it out of our food. We'd be arguing to ban this. But when our government determines that labeling is required for additives like food colorings, dyes, or other byproducts, it's not because they're found to be unsafe. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act establishes that the consumer has a right to know when something is added to food that changes it in a way that consumers would not likely recognize, and thus labeling is required. So for example, irradiation. Irradiated foods are required. Now you can't say absolutely irradiated foods are harmful or not harmful. As a matter of fact, in that instance, the advocates, the patent holders of irradiation technology, wanted it labeled because they were so proud of the technology, believing that it actually helps with food safety. Here, of course, you have the exact opposite. And again, it gets back to my Lily Tomlin comment. I mean, what are these folks afraid of? They're clearly afraid that we are going to, when it's labeled, they're not going to have sales. I mean, this is not a complicated discussion here. But here you had irradiation, which again wasn't on the basis of safety, but there was a definite change, as there is with genetic engineering. And the reality is that we do this with all kinds of things. We require labeling now for orange juice from concentrate versus fresh orange juice. I defy any of you to taste the difference between concentrate or not. I guarantee you, if I blind taste tested, half of you would choose one versus the other as being fresh. Country of origin we require as labeling. Wild versus farm are now required. These are processes that have nothing to do with safety. And so for any legislator, for any of us to make a decision that we should or shouldn't label based on safety would be missing the point altogether. Obviously 50 years ago we didn't label calories, fat, salt, kinds of fats. And by the way, as you can imagine, if we were having a discussion back then, food industry was against labeling that stuff. Now we know this information is critically important to making informed purchase decisions. And so again, we're required nowadays to label potential allergens and production methods, as I mentioned. But because again, the FDA found that these processes were relevant and material to the consumer. So I'm not arguing that GMOs should be labeled because they're proven health risks, but rather because they add bacterial genes and fragments to foods that have never before been seen in foods. And so there is, to my mind, something materially different about the foods, and I don't think that's really a debatable or controversial thing. So let me share a couple slides with you and get around to what I do think is material. So if you could go ahead to the first slide. As I mentioned before,